Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing study of 1968. In the previous lecture, we talked about the protest at Columbia University in the spring of 1968. And we talked a little bit about the nature of students, in particular as protesters, and the important role they played in that year. Now we're going to branch from those protests into a number of different directions as we begin to explore the international protests that went on all around the world throughout the year of 1968. And so as we begin looking at some of these international protests in particular, I want to start by talking a little bit more about the role of students in these international protests and some of the themes that will connect all of these different protests as we begin to explore 1968 in its global capacity. Protests and some form of chaos and uprisings arose in dozens of different countries around the world throughout 1968. So one of the great themes and questions that historians have debated about 1968 is how much these protests were connected to each other, how much they fed off of each other, or to what extent, as one historian has called it, was 1968 a great international coincidence? Was it just a series of independent actions, all arising independently of each other? Or how much are they interwoven? And so that's one of the themes that I invite students and those listening to this course to ponder for yourself, as historians have reached no consensus. While there might not be historical consensus about this, there are certainly many common points shared by most, if not all, of the protests around the world during that year. One of the most important is the central role played by youth in the great majority of these movements. And we'll talk about many of these as we go through them individually. I did mention some of these elements in the previous lecture, but I want to talk a little bit more about this as we get into more detail. Again, there's a new generation coming of age, and we talked about the baby boomers in the United States in particular. But this is a global phenomenon as well. World War II, it was a world war. It was a global war. And so that next generation all around the world, the children of that World War II generation are all coming of age around the same time. And so there are similar kinds of uprisings as we see at Columbia in the United States, young people rising up all around the world. Young people all around the world are becoming more important. They are becoming consumers. They are recognized by businesses and companies and advertisers. This is the baby boom generation all around the world. And with that recognition comes empowerment. As they are growing through their teenage years into the college age years and into adulthood, they are growing more powerful. And eventually, this generation is going to seize power from their parents' generation. And so that's part of what we see in these convulsions occurring all around the world, not only in 1968, 1967, 1969, and 70. It's the younger generation starting to seize control from that older generation. These young people all around the world are looking for guidance and leadership and inspiration, and find that inspiration in an array of revolutionaries that become common symbols to young people in many parts of the world. One of these is Andrei Sakharov. Sakharov was one of the leading scientists in the Soviet Union on their atomic bomb project, hydrogen bomb project, and other nuclear weapons throughout the late 1940s and through the 1950s. But gradually Sakharov became concerned about the implications of these weapons on a global scale and the prospect of the annihilation of the human race, which troubled a number of atomic scientists around the world. But Sakharov became one of the best known because starting in 1967, internally within the Soviet Union, he began speaking out against elements of this kind of research and began supporting the prospect of a peace agreement with the United States rather than simply growing and increasing this nuclear rivalry. In May of 1968, he completed an essay called Reflections on Progress, Peaceful Coexistence, and Intellectual Freedom, where he began to enunciate these ideas about striving for nuclear peace rather than proliferation and the prospect of war. As a result of this, he was banned by the Soviets from all military-related research, and while he was ostracized in his own community, he became an international hero for the peace movement and the youth movement. Later, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize and eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1975. Sakharov remained an international figure of great renown until his death in 1989. Another of these international symbols was the Czech dissident and author Ludvík Vaculík. We'll talk more about him shortly when we begin engaging with the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia in particular. But Vaculík called for the reassertion of basic human freedoms, including free speech, conscience, and equality. And his writings and speeches become one of the great themes of 1968. That is, personal courage in the face of repression. And again, we're going to talk more about this in just a moment. These and other revolutionaries who inspire young people all around the world tended to emphasize the humanity of their aspirations, which was not based on material possessions or success or fame. The economy should serve the needs of the many, they argued. There was an emphasis everywhere on real freedoms and true democracy, and we'll see these themes promoted in many of the international protests. Another commonality among these international protests, coming from the other side of the protest, is the response of world leaders to the protests occurring in their individual nations. And there are historians who debate and discuss how much did these leaders communicate with each other and reflect on each other. They certainly observed the protests happening in other countries as they considered how they might respond in their own. What are the causes of these protests? How can they prevent it? What kind of decisions are they going to make? There were leaders all around the world being thrown into very rapidly evolving situations and having to respond. What are those responses going to be? Are they going to respond with violence? Are they going to vigorously, force the protesters off the streets? Are they going to clamp down and restore order? Or are they going to negotiate and respond more thoughtfully to these kind of things? So we'll talk about a whole range of responses on the part of world leaders who are responding to the protests. Leaders like Charles de Gaulle, Leonid Brezhnev, and Lyndon Johnson, and many others struggled to maintain control in the face of these protests. They didn't relish the idea of deploying force against the young, idealistic protesters. Still, they reacted out of panic and what they thought was necessity. They feared the world was crumbling around them. They feared losing control in their own country. And they had supporters, as we have discussed and will continue to discuss in the United States. Many people around the world called for law and order in the face of these protests. Another theme to think about is that there's no fixed pattern of action. We'll talk about some commonalities and common themes, and the movement itself seems to be contagious. I will refer to the fever spreading around the world, and many other scholars have referred to this as a kind of contagion or a fever. But the methods and the particulars in each country are unique. In some countries, protesters had to be very careful. They might be killed outright simply for protest. In other countries, it was very common for protesters to be jailed and tortured and held for long periods of time, really without cause, without charges, without a trial. So in the United States, protesters felt little fear in chanting and marching and taking to the streets because, for the most part, in the United States, the response is not going to be just outright slaughter and murdering of the protesters. While there certainly is violent retaliation in some cases, but as we talk about protests around the world, there are many who literally have to fear for their lives as they take to the streets. We'll also talk about some common themes in the responses of governments around the world, which is some variation or mixture of reform and repression. Some governments rely more on repression than others. In the United States, state-sanctioned violence was common in the form of police beatings, temporary jailings, occasional shootings. But in other parts of the world, state-sanctioned activities were much harsher, including systematic arrest, torture, and even murder, re-education camps, lifelong prison sentences, disappearances, and as we'll talk about, at times even massacres of hundreds of citizens in one event. Another theme running through these international protests is the continued relevance of the Cold War, the dominance of the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then their kind of partner states as we trickle down around the world. On the one hand, the revolutions from below inspired cooperation among powerful states to maintain control. On the other hand, many who lived through it developed an attitude of reform. One example is Mikhail Gorbachev, who witnessed the Prague Spring and events in Czechoslovakia with admiration. He was so moved by Czechoslovakia's socialism with a human face that we'll talk about not too far down the road, that he embraced a freer and more open communist system decades later. At the same time, some historians argue that a direct result of the revolutions of 1968 is greater cooperation among the leading Cold War powers. Mao Zedong, Leonid Brezhnev, and Richard Nixon, in the years after 1968, moved closer to détente. By the early 1970s, they are more comfortable working with each other than with their own citizens in some cases. Leaders of the superpowers reached informal agreements as they all confronted what came to be distrusted regimes at the peripheries of their control. And so each of them kind of allow the others to maintain control in their own spheres. So as we will see, the United States doesn't try to intervene when the Soviets invade Czechoslovakia. The Soviets don't try to intervene with the United States activities going on in Vietnam. And there are many other examples of this as well. Another theme that can't be overestimated is the influence of Vietnam in these global protests. The successes of the Vietnamese against the United States showed repressed people everywhere that even the giant superpowers could be overturned. Let me read some words from one of the heroes of the Vietnamese, their General Von Nguyen Giap, about this conflict. He said, "Our people are fighting for our national cause, but also for socialism and for the other peoples in the world struggling for their own liberation. The myth of the invincibility of the United States, this colossus supporting itself impotently on the H-bomb, is collapsing irretrievably. No matter how enormous its military and economic potential, it will never succeed in crushing the will of a people fighting for its independence. Why did the United States think it would be victorious? It deployed an enormous war machine into our country. Westmoreland is a general who has found a way to boost the United States Expeditionary Force from 20,000 men to more than 500,000 without offering Washington anything in return but a light at the end of the tunnel. The Americans based their confidence that they would win the war on their superior numbers, their overwhelming armament, their riches in dollars, and in the tons of bombs they are dropping." This kind of resistance in the face of outright attack from a superpower served as inspiration and fuel for revolutionary and protest movements all around the world. Another common point was the influence of Che Guevara, who served as an inspirational figure. He was an Argentinian medical doctor who became a confidant and comrade of Fidel Castro. He joined the guerrilla movement to liberate Cuba in 1959. In 1960, with the success of the Cuban Revolution, Che and Fidel became heroes throughout Latin America. Che could have lived the high life. Instead, after the revolution, his thoughts turned to broader social and economic change. Che left Cuba, calling for a new world order. By the mid-1960s, he had drawn the ire of the United States by calling for, quote, many Vietnams to overthrow the armies of the Pentagon. He visited the Congo and incited rebellion there. Then he traveled to Bolivia. He tried to replicate the Cuban model by igniting peasant revolt in the jungles. Che was eventually cornered and captured, and shot dead on the orders of a CIA operative. He became a martyr. He had a beautiful face, whom some have compared to Jesus Christ himself. He became a role model for revolutionaries everywhere. He could have retired and lived the easy life, but instead he went back into the jungles to carry on the fight. In 1968, images of Che Guevara, like the one on the screen, were everywhere. A final theme running through many of the international movements seemed to be a shared hostility to technology. They identified with the peasants, with the common and simple folk. So revolutionaries used handwritten placards and posters when other methods were available. They were anti-computer, anti-bomb, anti-gun, anti-plane. They used sticks, rocks, Molotov cocktails, bricks, and other things for their weapons. They tore up the cobblestones in the streets of Paris, and so on. So why does it seem that these international protests take on a fever-like, a contagion-like quality, spreading all over the world in such a short time? Well, there are a number of common factors that people all around the world are confronting during this era. There seemed to be the breakdown of established authority and the search for new solutions. People all over the world were wondering why their governments were so inattentive and so ineffective in helping the common people. For young people in particular, there was simply a search for meaning in society. The Students for a Democratic Society, in their Port Huron statement in 1962, wrote, "The conventional moral terms of the age, the politician moralities, free world, people's democracies, reflect realities poorly, if at all, and seem to function more as ruling myths than as descriptive principles. Theoretic chaos has replaced the idealistic thinking of old, and unable to reconstitute theoretic order, men have condemned idealism itself. Doubt has replaced hopefulness, and men act out of a defeatism that is labeled realistic. The decline of utopia and hope is in fact one of the defining features of social life today." In such a climate, the individual began to feel insignificant within large institutions and bureaucracies. The militarized stalemate of the Cold War offered little hope to end any time soon, and in fact, it did linger for another 2 decades or more. Repressed peoples all around the world saw little hope for improvement in their situations. At the same time, energetic leaders around the world rebelled against these conditions. Some were national leaders like JFK, who revived pride and patriotism. Others were rebels, calling for grassroots resistance. And we'll talk about many of these leaders as we go over these international protests in 1968. In many cases, reforms following World War II created heightened expectations for change and improvement, especially the international emphasis on education after World War II. In 1967, there were 6 million college students in the United States. There were 2.5 million in Western Europe and 1.5 million in Japan. The students of 1968 had never really known unemployment or defeat. Students rebelled against their parents' generation, seeing them as having failed to meet the needs of the people. There was intense dissatisfaction with the present situation and growing pressure for change all over the world. Their tactics differed, and the sparking incidents and events differed. But most of these movements relied in some degree on disorder. In some cases, violence was celebrated. The victims of that violence became martyrs. Frustration bred rage. And this becomes the title of one of the famous books describing this era, Years of Hope, Days of Rage. While we emphasize Martin Luther King and his insistence on nonviolence in the United States, many of the groups protesting around the world in 1968 advocated violence. The Algerians versus the French regime, the National Liberation Front for South Vietnam, the Black Panthers in the United States, and there are many others. The disruptions started before 1968 and continued after, but 1968 in particular is noteworthy for the rapid succession of disorder, the intensity of these protests and events, and their geographic range. They truly did seem to fuel each other. Historians and many veterans of these 1968 movements raise many criticisms against the activists of 1968, and many have reflected back on their own actions of 1968 with questions. Among these criticisms are the fact that the protesters were simply wide-eyed and naive. They weren't rooted in realism. Some have argued that 1968 was merely a sort of international spasm that ultimately achieved little or nothing. Some argue that the war in Vietnam should and could have been won by the United States, that tactically and on the ground it just was not fought effectively. And then there are those who argue that this was just mindless anarchistic hostility to the state, that whatever was going on, people would have been protesting just to protest and for chaos and anarchy. So I'll conclude this lecture with a quote from one of the veterans of the movement of that era, who said, "Everybody was terribly young and didn't know what was going on. One had a sort of megalomaniac attitude that by sheer protest and revolt, things would be changed. It was true of the music, of the hallucinogens, of politics. It was true across the board. People threw themselves into activity without experience. The desire to do something became tremendously intense, and the capacity to do it diminished by the very way one was rejecting the procedures by which things could be done. It led to all sorts of crazy ideas." So we'll pick up that theme in our next lecture as we begin talking specifically about the series of international protests. And the first one we'll cover is the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia.